So let's just wait to see if we get anybody who's going to give us a thumbs up, maybe.
Okay. So I'm getting feedback now from somebody.
Okay, that's me. Yeah.
All right. All right. We'll start again. All right. This is the real one now. Okay, guys. This is it. Really. 3, 2, 1. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Shakespeare. We are bobbing along again today with Otto and Roger. And as you know, Otto is from Navakavada Buddhism. He is a Shakespeare connoisseur and a long-time member of LIT. So welcome, Otto.
Good to be here as always, Roberta.
Thank you. And our second panel member is Roger from Roger Hansen Live. He is a live streamer. He has a number of very interesting in-depth shows. He runs the Wonderful World of Weirdness channel on YouTube, and he is a Shakespeare pundit. Welcome, Roger.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Awesome. And today, just to get started, we have a few questions that have come in over the week. So I thought, gentlemen, if we could just start, I'll address this first one to you first, Otto, and then you, Roger. So,
Okay.
What is the point of looking back at history to a place that is so far away and trying to decide what happened back then?
Well, one thing, of course, there's a pat answer. You have to know where you've come from before you know where you're going, and that's sort of that is a pat answer. It's true enough. But for me, it's simply the fascination with the things that happened before. And I've often said that when we're looking at the past, it's like we're looking through a lattice work, and our view is blocked off necessarily because of our distance in time and space. So for me, it's fascinating to try to shift our focus a little bit, move a little bit behind the lattice, see what else we can see, what inferences we can make, and take the same data and try to see how they can be interpreted differently from the mainstream. As far as any intrinsic importance to studying the past, well, of course, we have to know where we came from in order to understand, where we are, and to give us ideas about where we're going. But for me, it's a more personal thing. I'm just curious. I'm just really interested, and I think that's the case with a lot of people. And because we are limited in what we can know about the past, the only other thing we can do is try to shift our perspective a little bit to try to get different views of what's going on. So for me personally, I think the main importance is just curiosity. I just really want to know about these things.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And Roger, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I agree with what Otto said there too, but like for me, being on the streams and talking to people, there's one thing else that I have noticed, and it's the lack of understanding that people have when it comes to history in the first place. Like, the first thing people think when they hear about people like Shakespeare or the nobles from back in the 1600s is they think that their lives were like our lives are today. You know what I mean? And a lot of people don't understand that we have a lot more freedom today in this world than what people back in the 1600s had, or people back 2,000 years ago, or people that lived 5,000 years ago, and automatically their mind says, that why are they doing that? And they don't understand that it was a different world back then than what it is today. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think that we've lost a connection to who we used to be compared to who we are now. You know what I mean? There's like no education that's telling you, look, this is the way it was back then. You know, so for me, I have
Yes.
to take I have to take my life and the way I live my life, and I have to move it out of the way, and I have to look at it from their perspective.
Mhm.
You know, and that
Interesting.
that's something
Yeah.
that I think a lot of people lack today.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Okay.
I see where you're coming from there. That's I've heard that called the presentist fallacy, the idea that people that we read about or study in the past acted or think the way we do in the present. And that's an important point. We do have to clear a lot of our preconceptions out of the way when we're trying to understand what was going on hundreds and hundreds of years ago, or even thousands of years ago. A lot of the things that we take for granted and think are just obvious ways of thinking would never even occur to people back then. So that is a very
Right.
good and important point.
Mm. Okay, well, let's do the second question then. This one says, I haven't heard of suggestive evidence before. It's obviously not something that'll hold up in a court of law. So why should we consider it? Let's start with Roger and then go to Otto on this one.
Well, first of all, I don't really trust 3/4 of the things that can stand up in the court of law. You know, yeah,
Good point.
most of the laws that are freaking being obeyed today are statutory laws, and those laws stem from old, like, uh, Roman laws that were created like 2,000 years ago. You know.
Yeah.
So when it comes to most of this information and stuff, the reason why I listen to it is because I enjoy it. Just like you said, Otto. You know, I don't care if people like this topic or if they don't like this topic. I like this topic. You know. I do it because of the enjoyment, you know, and you don't find too many people who actually want to know about their past, and they don't want to know about where they came from, and that's fine. I'm okay with that. I mean, if that's the kind of life that you want, then go ahead and be that way, but I just choose to not be that way. I'm a very curious person. You know, I've always loved searching out things, you know, and I find mystery and stuff like this and excitement. You know, you can do the same 9 to 5 every day of the week if you want to, but you're still gonna have a miserable life. You know, I mean, get a hobby.
Yes.
And that's what I've got. I've got a hobby. You know, this. I wouldn't invest thousands and thousands of dollars into trying to find out the truth behind Shakespeare. You know, I don't want to go broke.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, you're not obsessive, but
Right.
So what do you think then, Otto, about suggestive evidence?
well, yeah, I know what he's talking about because a couple of times last time I talked about things that are you know not really what I'd call proof, but are very suggestive, such as and that chart that I posted last time. I don't know if we showed it to the viewers, but just linguistic analysis of the use of certain words in the plays of Christopher Marlowe, the few plays that were attributed to him. And when you chart them with Shakespeare's use of these same words, you can see a pattern that seems to show a certain, you know, growth in the use of these words. And again, I was saying this is very suggestive. And I think the reason we have to look at suggestive evidence is, well, first of all, I'd point out that a lot of our historical evidence is suggestive. A lot of the things that the Stratfordians accept are purely suggestive. You know, the mainstream Stratfordian view of Shakespeare is full of phrases like, you know, we are confident in assuming, and we imagine that, and since this school existed in Stratford-on-Avon, then we are confident in assuming that the young Will Shakespeare attended, and all these sorts of things. So a lot of this is suggestive evidence too. And it gets back again to that whole very limited access we have to the past. Suggestive evidence is sometimes the only evidence we have, and even though one piece of suggestive evidence might not, quote unquote, stand up in court, you can build a preponderance of evidence. In other words, things that can show a likely direction for things to be in. And so I think it's important to look at this, because sometimes it's all we have. And things suggesting things, again, it's simply a suggestion. And I'm going to echo Rob here too, where this is basically an interest that we're having here. This isn't going to decide the fate of empires or anything like this. But if we're going to talk about this subject and look at these issues, this is the evidence that we have to work with. And as Roger points out, it's great fun. This is again, part I sometimes call it the Cirque du Soleil of the mind. Where it gets back where you allow your mind to do these gymnastics, and the only rules is that you're consistent in your assumptions, and that they stick to the evidence that we have. It's confined to things that we can talk about. And if we do have suggestive evidence, we're careful to point that out. We're not claiming, yes, this is so. We can say, well, this kind of suggests this. Let's look at this idea.
Yes.
So that's what I would say. Okay.
That's really interesting. Okay, so the third question is from somebody who is obviously a little bit more sensitive about it and not taking it in the same investigative spirits that we are. He says, isn't this whole conversation just feeding into the anti-colonialist narrative? Isn't doubting Shakespeare just another way of devaluing the English language? What would you say to that, Otto?
I don't see it personally. I mean, if you were trying to prove that Shakespeare was written by somebody from Africa, perhaps, then that might be feeding into that. But really, this is simply a literary authorship question, and this is not unknown. And as we were talking about last time, and some of the points Roger brought up for discussion tonight have to do with the fact that even mainstream scholars accept that a lot of Shakespeare was not written by Shakespeare. Titus Andronicus, it's long been thought that a lot of the blank verse, including Titus Andronicus, may very well have been the work of Marlowe. Greensman mentioned Kidd. Collaborations were the rule there. So from to a Stratfordian, I would say, look, you're already admitting it's quite likely that a lot of these plays were collaborative. Maybe more of them are too. And but as far as the anti-colonialist thing, I mean, nobody's suggesting that anyone else other than someone who was active in the English Renaissance was responsible for these plays. So I don't really see how it does. I don't really see it arising. I mean, there are plenty of another literary debate has to do with the authorship of the book Frankenstein, which is attributed to Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, but she never wrote anything quite like that before or since. And when people asked Percy Shelley if he helped write it, he just wouldn't comment. he just wouldn't. I don't want to talk about it. So so it's simply another literary debate. But I don't really see how it connects to the whole anti-colonialist movement at all, personally.
Yeah, no, me neither. What do you think, Roger? You thought that it might be Mark asking that question.
Well, there's a good chance that it was Mark answering that question, because he's like that. He just didn't. Okay. He just didn't give the question to you. It was somebody else to give to you. But I guarantee you, Mark was probably asking that question to somebody. But with anti-colonialist, see, those are big words that I have to get a dictionary to understand. When it comes to like Shakespeare and England, okay, it has absolutely nothing to do with other countries or anything like that. Otto mentioned the talking points that I brought up, and here before long we're going to be getting into them, and we'll be talking about some of the stuff that these questions are mentioning, like talking about suggestive, what was it, suggestive
Evidence.
evidence, and there's enough evidence that's not suggestive that we'll be talking about too tonight when it comes to the actual vocabulary of Shakespeare. And with this anti-colonialism thing, I would also have to mention the fact too that there were people that were English writers who I can talk about too as well tonight, who were dead set against Shakespeare. Maybe not saying it was another person, but they didn't like Shakespeare's writings. So and the reason why I bring that up is because you hear a lot, or I've heard a few comments from people that I've had these conversations with saying, well, why is it that this has only happened since the 19th century? And the truth of the matter is there's been people who were against Shakespeare's writings way before then, so with that, I'm not going to spill over into any extra stuff, but these are English writers too, or some of them are, but
yes,
but you know what I'm saying, like
fascinating. Yeah,
I don't see it as being anti-colonialism. Shakespeare's writings was great writings. I'll put that out there, okay? I just personally don't believe that it was written by one man who had the name William Shakespeare. That's it. The writings are beautiful. Yeah. I mean, they're a masterpiece. So that's all I have.
Yes.
That's all I have to
they
say
really
about
are.
it.
Well, you mentioned earlier, Otto, you mentioned Titus Andronicus, and I believe it was George Peele who collaborated with that. Did he, or was he the one that commented on the collaboration?
Well, we don't know exactly who collaborated. I've heard several different people mentioned as possible collaborators on Titus Andronicus. Titus has been I don't know if you're familiar with the play. It's been a sort of a thorn in the side for people for a while because it's a very violent play. It's full of spectacle. There's very little real literary merit to it. I mean, there are a few scenes that are pretty powerful, but you notice you don't see people quoting Titus Andronicus a lot. They don't teach Titus Andronicus in school because the thing is basically a potboiler. Very violent. It's all full of like sex and violence basically. Mm-hmm. And in fact, some people I remember early on thought this thing is just a Marlowe. It's very Marlovian in that. If you read Tamburlaine or any of that thing, it's again a lot of bombast, a lot of violence, and things like that. So I've even heard of people who wanted to completely remove Shakespeare's name from Titus Andronicus at all, and of course, authorship attribution from plays that old. I mean, we know there were several plays that were published under the name William Shakespeare that were not included in the first folio. And it's not a big stretch to imagine that there might be some plays in the first folio that were misattributed. So,
right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And again,
Gosh, it's fascinating.
This can be a step, like I say, to talk to a Stratfordian about the authorship question. Because you're already kind of halfway there when you're saying, well, look at the style, look at this, look at that, and allowing yourself to see other styles in Shakespeare, because you've also got the Stratfordians that are like, no, it's got his name on it. It must be him. How do you know? Well, it's got his name on it. I mean, and they just don't want to go any further than that.
Mm. Well, we had quite an in-depth look last week at Christopher Marlowe, and one of the things that you had in your notes, Roger, was that Marlowe was one of the university wits. And the university wits was a group of people who collaborated with each other in their writings, weren't they?
Yeah, and George Peele was one of the members of the university wits.
Aha. Right.
Now that brings me into my whole thing about, for me personally, I feel that these university wits were actually some of the writers who wrote William Shakespeare. Okay, and the deal with George Peele that I've been finding out is there's a lot of resistance about George Peele being involved with Titus Andronicus or whatever, Andronicus. And it's really strange when you get into that, because it's like people don't want to even admit that this man had any influence with that play whatsoever, or Shakespeare, you know what I mean, one way or the other. But the thing of it is well, like we were getting to with like the evidence. Okay, now these experts, they've been actually doing scientific research on it. There's a stylistic analysis that's going on where researchers have used computational methods to basically create a stylistic fingerprint of Shakespeare's entire corpus of plays. Okay, so
Wow.
they've basically created this fingerprint of his writing. So when they take his writing and then they add in Peele's writing, okay, they can
Yeah.
come up with an analysis of
Mm-hmm.
of how much of an influence Shakespeare actually had on this play, and how much of influence Peele had on this play. And they've done this, and they've got the numbers down to an art on it. I mean, it's really gotten into it. And the thing of it is well, what I found out from my research is that researchers found that some of Shakespeare's earlier works, such as Henry VI plays and Titus Andronicus, were thought to be collaborations. And the reason for it is because they found Shakespeare's influence in it, and then they also found George Peele's influence in it. You know what I mean? But even though they turn around and they find this evidence, they still want to say that the university wits and Shakespeare had absolutely nothing to do with one another. To this
Fascinating.
to this day, they still refuse to admit that the university wits and Shakespeare had anything to do with one another.
And why, Roger? Why is you have this group of people who are collaborating with each other, and who are writers, and who are all pinging off each other and talking to each other and experimenting with each other's styles. And then you have these troops of actors who are all getting together and ad-libbing and adding in bits, and the play is alive and moving forward. It's odd to me that we can look at this history and we can see this way that these plays were put together, and yet people can say there wasn't collaboration. Do you think that's just what you were mentioning earlier about people not being able to project back into the past?
I think that it has to do even with today. Like today they call it ghostwriting, and people today just use a different term for it. But like for me personally, I believe that these people were involved in writing Shakespeare's plays. I mean, in some way, you know what I mean? And that's one reason why it was so important to make sure that their whereabouts and what they were doing had to be separate from everything that appeared to be what Shakespeare was doing. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I'm at with that. You know what I mean? And I don't know. To me, it's really odd that Shakespeare's two playhouses that he did own too, also is supposedly never been involved with the university wits as well. You know what I mean? They were separated in every way, even the playhouses.
What's your take on it, Otto?
Well, again, it is interesting when we're looking at actual contemporary remarks about Shakespeare. You know, you've got things that were written by people that were living at the time. You know, like the famous line about the upstart crow from Green's worth of wit, and things like that. A shake scene. And these are probably with a good deal of reason, attributed to or considered to be a reference to Shakespeare. Then you get like people writing, like within a century later, saying, "Well, we had this tradition, or we had that tradition, or something like that." But as far as the university wits, it's interesting the criticisms that they make about Shakespeare's work. It does seem to be like just artists jabbing at each other, you know. And as far as the collaborations go, I think that there is very firm evidence. And as Roger was pointing out, we've got good statistical evidence. They've done, they've analyzed the word order and the use of certain words. And again, these are very suggestive. Again, it's like I always say, unless you've got a time machine, you can actually watch somebody putting ink dipping his quill into the ink and writing. We'll never know for absolutely sure. But you can definitely see the style of certain people being reflected. And I will point something else out too, and this gets back to something you'd mentioned that your mom talking about, the production of literature at that time. It was often a long, drawn-out collaborative process, and I always bring up, even in more recent times, James Barrie with the play Peter Pan. That was never performed the same way twice. The play was constantly being updated, revised. So these guys would get a play, possibly an unauthorized play, and the author might not even be aware of what's done to it. And again, people would change things from playhouse to playhouse, from scene to scene. It was kind of a Wild West when it came to literature. So, and of course, that can make it more problematic when you're trying to trace an actual influence down.
Yes.
But I do think these tools, like Roger points out, there are tools that we do use today that can give us a very good idea, I think, of what was going on. And of course, a lot of what we're taught today about Shakespeare is going to go through that filter of the mainstream Stratfordian paradigm. So yeah, there are going to be some things that they're going to be very reluctant to allow, as part of that paradigm. And yet so much of it is simply presupposition. We are confident in assuming kind of things.
Yes.
And that's where we have wiggle room to be having these discussions.
Right. It was interesting for me reading your notes, Roger, that some of the names, some of the people who have queried Shakespeare, like Ben Jonson, John Dryden, Samuel Johnson, and Alexander Pope, they didn't question Shakespeare as being the author as much as they didn't like his style, and they didn't like his bad language, and they didn't like his frivolity.
Right.
So it's not just that people don't think that he wasn't capable of writing them. They also think that what he wrote was rubbish.
Well, that goes back to also what I said about our way of thinking today compared to back then. Now, see, back then they had laws of writing when it came to the classical writing. So when Shakespeare came around, what he was actually writing to the people back then was garbage. Okay, and today we say, "Oh, he's such a great person," and but these writers, and these are well-known classical trained writers. Okay, they looked at it and they said, "This is garbage. This is trash." You know what I mean? And today we don't think that way when we think of Shakespeare. Shakespeare is just like the greatest thing on the face of the planet. You know what I mean? One of them even wanted to go through and freaking edit Shakespeare's writing so that it sounded proper.
It's incredible.
Yeah, Bowdlerized it. Yeah.
I mean, so you need to kind of put that into perspective when you think about that, okay? Like, we think the world of Shakespeare's writing, but these writers criticized his writing and didn't like it. They thought that his writings were mediocre, you know, and he didn't use the classical language very well at all. Like a lot of the old Roman references that he makes has been they've been trying to link them to old pamphlets that were put out of really bad Latin stories that were being put out during that time period, which I can understand that's probably where Shakespeare got all that from, because they weren't very historically correct, you know, in a lot of their ways. And I did a little research on that one. I didn't get too deep into it, but I can see that, you know what I mean? But there's other things in his writings that aren't, that don't fit that, you know what I mean? There's things that he couldn't have possibly known, so. But these writers, these other ones, man, they just, and they had valid reasons for being against his writing, because a lot of Shakespeare's writings during that time, they were vulgar. You know what I mean? He would he would freaking compare kings to clowns. He would use lofty verse with vulgarity. He'd compare mortals to fairies. You know, things like that. So in their minds, this was just nothing but. This was vulgar, you know. That's really the best way I could say it.
Do you think that it suggests, Otto, that maybe Ben Jonson saying that he had no command of the classical language and its rules, do you think that suggests that maybe it could have been William Shakespeare and not one of the very highly trained hens of Francis Bacon?
Well, yeah, I think the famous line was that he had small Latin and less Greek. I think part of it, what occurs to me now, and I was just thinking this now, is that we hear these remarks, and we have to keep in mind they didn't have emojis back then, or emoticons. I have a feeling that some of these writers would really snip and snap at each other in ways that might seem a lot more brutal or mean than it might have been. I mean, I'm just thinking about if I'm hanging out with some friends of mine that are musicians and we're playing music together, or we might make some jokes about each other's ability or about a particular, you know, project we did, that if you just read it out flat would seem like we're really badly sniping at each other. Now that aside, though, yeah, there were definitely people that didn't like Shakespeare's work. I mean, Shakespeare tends to be put up on a pedestal these days. I think he's a classic, and I believe it was Mark Twain who defined a classic as a book that everyone praises and nobody reads. And so he's been very enshrined now, but in his day, yeah, you know, although a lot of people liked his plays, a lot of people didn't like his plays. And again, some of those plays are just chock full of violence, and some of them would probably be, if they were performed in their entirety, rather boring to the groundlings. You know, one wonders about, how well you could perform a play like Hamlet in its entirety. Excuse me. I don't think it's ever been performed completely uncut. It's such an incredibly long play with some very, very involved dialogue and monologues. So, in fact, it's been suggested that that play marks a time when private indoor theaters were starting to happen, and you would be able to have a smaller, more intimate audience that could actually hear clearly all your words. I mean, just imagine the Elizabethan theater that, the groundlings popping open their bottles of ale, catcalls, drunks getting up on the stage because they had a clutch their little tester in their hand to pay their fee and set their stool up right on the stage to clown around with the actors. And of course, that gets back to so many of these performances must have been very impromptu. It's like I made the comparison before with the Marx Brothers. We see these Marx Brothers films, especially their first 3 or 4 films. They basically set up a camera in front of their regular Broadway stage show. But those shows, each show was different. The boys were always ad-libbing, getting involved with the audience. But a play like Hamlet, you really can't do things like that. You need to really stick to it. It's a very involved play with a very complex and direct message, a lot of subtlety to it. So that would imply like a change in how theater was presented. So, but yeah, and some of the people we're talking about. I mean, yeah, Ben Jonson was criticizing him, and then later people like Samuel Johnson and Alexander Pope, Max Muller, we were talking about expurgating Shakespeare and cleaning him up. Pope was involved in that sort of a thing, and I think it was Aleister Crowley who said something to the effect that, well, of course Shakespeare is our greatest poet, but of course he's awful.
So interesting to me that they criticize him. Samuel Johnson criticized him for having implausible plots. I think that part of the whole sort of Shakespeare genre is that a lot of it was comedy, wasn't it? It wasn't meant to be a serious history or a serious commentary on the time, was it?
Yeah, that Dr. Johnson was he liked to pick at things, I think, sometimes. I think they mentioned in our talking points, Johnson deplored his fondness for punning. I think puns are great, so that's a personal call. But yeah, a lot of these plays, the people came there because they wanted to see that show. I mean, look at the titles, As You Like It. I mean, it's just saying to the audience, this is the way you like it. We're going to have a happy ending, and we're going to have a hero and a heroine, and it's going to be a duke living off in the woods. And As You Like It is basically a Robin Hood fantasy. So yeah, again, these were meant to be entertainment. All these plays and all the actors, they were there in show business. They were in the entertainment industry, and it's hard work. And but no, nobody's expecting it to be real. I don't think that the crowds, the groundlings especially, were going there expecting them to have every detail right of what Henry VIII's court looked like or what Julius Caesar would have been wearing. And they certainly didn't care about the implausibility of the plot. They had to get through that play within a couple of hours. We were talking, what was it about, a situation comedy. You were talking about that, Roberta, when you were a kid. You realize in a half-hour show you've got 10 minutes to present the problem, 10 minutes to solve the problem, 10 minutes to resolve the problem. No, 10 minutes to present it, 10 minutes to have the problem, 10 minutes to resolve the problem, and at the end of the show, everything has to be right back where it was at the beginning of the show. And people want that. They want their usual little drama. So as far as the implausible plots goes, come on, Dr. Johnson. Was that on Blackadder? That marvelous brain box, Dr. Johnson.
I've got to agree with you too. Like the puns, I think is really what drove these guys nuts. I think the puns are what really drove them nuts more than anything else. They hated it. Every single one of them mentions that.
Yeah.
puns.
Well, I think they resented the idea that somebody would write funny stuff that it was what we would consider today Beavis and Butthead. I think Beavis and Butthead are hilarious, but there are some people that he dares to make a pun, he dares to make a joke that the groundlings will laugh at. That's half your craft there, man. You've got to make the audience laugh, and they love fun.
And we have this criticism. But another thing that we're now going to discuss, I think that we should now discuss, is that Shakespeare introduced thousands and thousands of new words into the English language. So you have that sort of very broady element to it, and the irreverent element.
Right.
But at the same time, you have this extraordinary explosion of learning and cultured thought making its way from the court to the common man. That's quite a fascinating thing that happened there. It's almost as if a new type of education began, or a sharing of knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was certainly. What was that saying? Shakespeare had no dictionary and was free. This, what you're mentioning about the new words introduced by Shakespeare. That's one of the biggest arguments, suggestive though it is. I think that Baconians have. The creator of these words showed a masterful knowledge. This isn't small Latin and less Greek. This is somebody who understood these languages quite well. And we have to bear in mind when we read about contemporary criticism of Shakespeare, whether it's Green or Johnson or whoever, we don't know exactly who they were referring to. I mean, again, if we don't know the actual face behind Shakespeare, and especially if, as I think is very likely, and as Roger says, these might have very well have been a committee, and I think chaired by Sir Francis Bacon. They could very well have been talking about young Will Shakespeare or somebody using that name that had nothing to do with some of these plays. So and of course it is also good, before I forget to remember now, when these words are introduced by Shakespeare, that doesn't guarantee that he invented them. It's simply this is the first time that we actually read them. Some of them may very well have been in use. There's the one line where he was talking. It was in Henry IV, where they're marching. The Falstaff's been given a charge of foot, and he sent, I think it was Bardolph ahead, and he meets the guy and he goes, I hope Sir John and his lady wife are fine. And the reply was, well, he doesn't have a wife. A soldier is better accommodated, or something like that. I forget the exact line. And the word accommodated, the justice goes, oh, accommodated, from accommodato. What a good term that is. It's just, so that might imply that was a new word being brought back by soldiers. The language was always evolving. But that aside, there are so many new words introduced by Shakespeare that, yeah, I think that he had to have created a great deal of them, words that are simply attested nowhere else. And it's not like he was writing in isolation. There was a great deal of writing, and as you pointed out, Roberta, there was really a lot more reading and writing going on. A lot more education was available, and especially reading and writing in vernacular languages. You weren't just confining yourself to Latin anymore, although some authors were still writing in Latin thinking, well, this is the permanent language. But that was starting to change, and especially with the English language with a standardized orthography, which I think really helped to make that next step of going from a book being something that was read out loud to silent reading. Much easier to do when you've got a standard spelling from book to book, or even from page to page, because I've read these old books, and if a compositor would run out of one letter, well, he would just, throw another one. We ran out of I's, I'll just use a J or a Y or, whatever. So yeah, this was also a quantum leap in how we process this material. And I've seen it argued that Hamlet was really meant more to be read than performed. Again, it's such an enormously long play compared to most of the others. So I think that's all. It was all an interlocking process, though.
Yes. Well, we have a comment here in the in the comments. Fascinating that we would have a comment in the comments. Right. Ferox Phasma says, speaking of writers who hated Shakespeare's work, see Lear Tolstoy and the Fool, an essay by George Orwell. Tolstoy attacks Shakespeare, and Orwell attacks Tolstoy's attack. That sounds like something interesting.
Yeah.
So,
We should
wow.
read that and do this next week. I'd be very happy to read that. In fact, I have a friend of mine who's very interested in Russian literature that might want to get involved too.
Oh, cool. Well, he's dropped the link, so yeah, let's.
We'll check that out. Thank you, Ferox Phasma.
That's pretty
That's
good.
cool.
Open to that.
Yeah.
Tune in next week and we'll talk about it.
And we
No,
will be talking about your subject. Sorry, yes, carry on, Roger.
Before we move on to that, can I read out the talking notes that I made about the vocabulary and everything when it
Yes,
comes
please.
Yes,
to
please.
Shakespeare?
Please, yes.
Okay, now William
Yes.
Shakespeare's vocabulary, words that Shakespeare was known to have used was 20,000 words in his plays.
Wow.
Shakespeare's works provide the first recorded use of over 17,000 words in the
My
English
goodness.
language.
Amazing.
It's believed that Shakespeare may have even invented or introduced many of these words himself. Now, 35,000 words that Shakespeare knew but didn't use in his composition. That's 35,000 words that he never used. Now,
Yeah.
combining both Shakespeare's active and passive vocabulary, it is estimated that his vocabulary was about 65,000 words.
Gosh.
What she invented, many, many thousands.
Yeah.
Wow.
And just, I was debating on if I wanted to say this, but I figured I'd go ahead and say it. The other day, bobdub turned me on to something that I thought was pretty cool, and it was on Bing. He had those AI. So I asked Bing AI these questions, and they put this out to me, and I checked them over, and they even had links and stuff to go to check them out to make sure that they were right. So
Nice.
it's pretty good.
Fascinating.
So
Yes.
It can be useful when used skillfully. Yeah.
yeah, I thought it was pretty nifty. So
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It is.
You know, this whole vocabulary thing, it strikes me too. I mean, yes, I think it's a good argument for the Baconian authorship, but it also does point towards that idea of a committee. Because think of how many more words you would have when you've got like some of the top writers in Renaissance England,
mhm.
you know, working under the direction of one of the top minds the planet's ever seen. Because that's a lot of vocabulary to create in a very short time.
And another fascinating thing was, it wasn't just the words that they introduced, it was whole phrases that we still use today. I was reading earlier about the amount of little words that have come out of the plays that are just our everyday English.
Uh-huh.
You know, I can't think of any of them at the moment, I'm afraid. But yeah, so it was not just the words themselves, but the way that the words were used and strung together.
I was thinking you meant like aphorisms, like it's an ill wind that blows no one to good, and things
Yeah,
like that. Yeah,
those
yeah,
sort of things, yes.
yeah.
And hen's teeth, I think. You know, funny.
Mhm.
A lot of those, the jokey, like sort of
Well,
old wives' tale-y
right.
sayings that we have.
Or to be or not to be, you know.
Yes.
classic thing. A horse,
Yeah.
a horse.
Most famous one of them all right there. To
Yeah.
be, yeah.
Yes.
No, the average person, English speaker, has a vocabulary range. An adult who's native English, today they have an average vocabulary of 20,000 to 35,000. Okay, but
Huh.
they also say that back then, during that time period, that the vocabulary was much smaller, and it was mostly due to illiteracy, like what Otto or you've been discussing. You know what I mean? Like their vocabulary was a lot smaller because there was a lot more illiteracy during that time
Yeah.
period. But
Mhm.
on the bright side, though, people between 18 and 24 today typically have a vocabulary size of only 10,000 words.
Wow.
Mm.
So
Wow.
that kind of gives you an idea, because even 18 to 24 years old, they've still been educated in school. You know what I mean?
Yeah, in theory, yeah, you've been graduated from high school at 18, so in theory, you're supposed to have a good vocabulary, you know.
Right. So
I guess it's enough to call on, but
so it kind of gives you an idea of how much smaller the vocabulary range
right.
was back during the 1600s. So it would have had to have been less than freaking 10,000
Yeah.
words.
Definitely.
You know, because I personally have no doubt in my mind that an 18-year-old would have a better vocabulary than most people in the 1600s. There's no doubt in my mind, because kids,
You would hope anyway. Although the education system today, you never know.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well, it is.
that's
Carry
another
on.
thing too that strikes me too, is like, why are they always beating around the bush on the whole vocabulary thing when it comes to back then? Like, I understand history was really, hard to pull together because of information, but linguistics started with frickin' the Brothers Grimm. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that was during the same time period. So with linguistics today, they should still be able to come up with some kind of idea about vocabulary. Well, vocabulary has more to do with writing. And never mind.
Yeah,
I didn't think about
it's
that.
it is really, really interesting though that you. It seems the more we talk that Francis Bacon is just pivotal and central in this whole era. The language, the overseas knowledge, all these things that were being brought from the continent to England.
Yeah.
It just seems like there was a real change in the structure, in the class structure, as if somehow the information that had been all stored away in the upper classes was now being shared with the sort of common man, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you basically, I think you're talking about a lot of interacting factors. Social mobility
Mm-hmm.
is one of the key concepts of what you're talking about here, because Elizabethan England was an amazingly volatile time. You had an absolute monarchy, an incredibly intense police state, but like many despotisms, which practiced severe political and, of course, in their time, religious repression, and of course, religion and politics were identical. And that's another thing about that we don't understand here in the present. That's the presentist valley. To these people, their religion and their government, their politics were indissoluble. They were all inexorably intertwined. So while you had the Elizabethan state was very, very, like we were talking about, the number of people, I think it was like 4 people the previous month had been executed for religious irregularities. Just before Christopher Marlowe was killed. In the same way in England and in a lot of despotisms to this day, as long as you weren't being a political or a political religious troublemaker, you had a great deal of personal freedom, a great deal of personal opportunities. And let's think about the Golden Hind for a moment. When the Golden Hind returned from its round the world voyage, it brought back, I believe it was something like 2 years worth of the gross national product of the entire Kingdom of England.
Gosh.
And that was the Queen's cut. That was the Queen's cut. Who knows how much more he didn't tell her about. I never talk about that in history. But seriously, this was, it's just an amazing, that is, I think, the equivalent of people suddenly becoming Bitcoin billionaires, or Chainlink billionaires suddenly. People from nowhere, or people that are like maybe upper middle class. There's a great deal of social mobility, and that included people going downward, ask Essex. But seriously, though, it was a time when education was within more people's reach. And we talked a little about this last time. Reading and writing were two different skills. They were taught separately, and a lot of times somebody could read and not necessarily have the skill of the pen, being able to cut a quill and dip it, and very, it's not like ballpoint pens. So, things were, you could learn to read possibly one way, and then later on, as you got more successful, you might take up writing. But as long as you could read well and you had like some scribes and clerks, you could be a successful businessman. I mean, Charlemagne could never write. They'd make much of his illiteracy, but he could read. He just couldn't sign his name very well, but he could read well enough to make sure that his seal wasn't put on anything that he didn't want it put on, sort of thing. So, but there was a lot of social mobility. There was a great deal of new wealth that was going all over the place. But at the same time, you did have a great deal of political repression, aimed mostly at, the Catholics. You got to remember, every Roman Catholic, and there were doubtless many people who were Roman Catholics in their hearts in Elizabethan England, the recusants so-called, did not regard Elizabeth as a legitimate monarch. We've seen examples of that, today. And as a result, it caused a great deal of unrest that you don't read about directly, but which the government was very worried about indeed. Of course, the UK government's always been a little, because it wasn't the UK then, but I mean, they were worried about Jacobinism right into the early 20th century. I think we talked a little about that. So they might be a little touchy on the subject, but still. So yeah, there was a lot of knowledge that was suddenly available, and there was an explosion in printing of books because people could afford to buy books now. And the process of printing was better understood. Technology was a big drive of that, and people liked to read, and they were reading vernacular English. And again, this gets back to empowering people that don't necessarily have that university education that presupposed knowledge of the Latin and usually Greek languages, at least at the Oxford colleges. So it's one of those things where I think was like a snowball effect. And when you had people writing very brilliantly, as just in Francis Bacon's acknowledged writings in the vernacular, I think that was a sign the vernacular came of age. And I think that was a big part of the Renaissance, is like, the Romans weren't trying to write in a foreign language, at least not at their peak. Later on, yeah, they all did learn Greek. That's another story. And they basically became Greek. But no, the Romans wrote in their native tongue. They didn't put any weird fancy language. And so, Englishmen, and for that matter, Frenchmen and Germans and whoever would write in their native tongues for their people, just as the Romans did for theirs.
Yes, right. Well, on that note, I think that we're going to have to call it for today. We've had a really, really interesting discussion. I think that there are a whole lot of things we had here in the notes that we haven't yet got to. But it's very good, I think, to go through this, and I'm so pleased. Thank you so much, Ferox Phasma, for your suggestion and that link. That's, good to get onto some of the other opinions. But just before we finish off, let me just ask you, gentlemen, if you have final words. Roger, what is your finishing off thoughts for today?
Well, today, first let me say something too when it comes to these talking notes, okay? The talking notes, there's a lot in there, but with these talking notes, it doesn't matter about finishing it all. It was just a way of kind of like giving some ideas to talk about, you know what I mean? So
Right, yeah.
so not finishing them or covering all of them isn't really important when it comes to that. But with that being said, I would also like to say that, you know, again, for anybody who thinks that we're trying to change the world by doing research on Shakespeare, just put that out of your mind, okay? Anybody who thinks that they can do it by researching this stuff and making some crazy change is out of their mind, and I'm definitely not going to be spending any money doing this stuff, because if you want to hear about craziness, I can talk to you about the Baconian cipher. All right, now that is crazy, and we haven't even brought that up. So just be great.
We're getting there.
Yeah, just be
These
great.
are the introductory shows.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, Roger, we're getting there. We're getting there. We want to know all about the ciphers. I think you have a whole lot of things up your sleeve too, don't you, Otto?
Well, you know, the ciphers, that is a can of worms that is almost limitless.
Yeah.
Almost limitless. It would be fun to get into some of them. I don't know if you're familiar with, I forget the guy that built it, but it was like a Shakespeare mangle. It was like the guy took a couple of drums and took all of the pages of the first folio and all the pages of these other works that he attributed to Shakespeare and pasted them all from left to right and put them on a big drum and made a belt out of it. He would crank it along to find correspondences there, and I have no idea how it was supposed to work. It still exists, though. It'd be interesting to recreate, but yeah, people have gotten very intense about the ciphers and stuff. All I'll say is that they're suggestive.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, on that suggestive note, we are going to call it for today. Thank you so much, Otto and Roger. Thank you very much indeed, audience, for being with us. It's great to have you here and dropping your questions through the week and your suggestions. And we will be back again next week for the next interesting chapter. So for today, goodbye, thank you, and we'll see you again next time.